Welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am talking with Daniel Sznycer. Daniel is an assistant professor at the Department of Psychology at Oklahoma State University. He is an evolutionary psychologist, and his major research areas are on sociality, value computation, morality, and various emotions. That's mostly what we talk about in this conversation. Much of our conversation focuses on two emotions, shame and anger, but that we also talk about other components of his research as well, kind of mixed into the conversation. We start talking about the recalibration theory of anger. Dan gives a really nice overview of the theory and where it sits within other theories. We talk about the impact of social valuation of anger. We talk about cross-cultural findings. And then we shift to shame, and we kind of park here for a while. Obviously, shame, the emotion shame is an interest of mine, as folks that know have listened to other episodes. And I was really interested to get his kind of take on shame. We talk about the global self as being necessary for a definition in shame. We talk about the other aspect of shame and the kind of standard attribution theory. And then we also, towards the end of the conversation, talk about how pride impacts shame. Say this is a really nice conversation because much of it is, I would say, very conversational in a lot of senses. And in other ways, though, it's really nice because we were able to kind of get in the weeds about some of the research on shame and anger, which is, I think, nice. I mean, sometimes some conversations, it's nice to have a very good overview and explain things, but I also really enjoy kind of some of the more dense insider kinds of discussions on the literature and things like that. And Dan's obviously brilliant at this. He's doing this research daily, so he's in it way more than I am. We have a really nice conversation kind of on the shame piece about this kind of other aspect, how much others are needed to define or not, how shame is or is not expressed. And so you hear us go kind of back and forth on that in a really nice kind of way. So I really got a lot out of this conversation. It was so edifying and such an enjoyment for me, and I think for Dan as well. And I think you can kind of hear us just kind of nerding out for a little bit, which is which is great. I love that stuff. So now I bring you Daniel Sznycer. I'm here with Daniel Sznycer. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I've been looking forward to talking to you and talk about emotions and emotion theory and research and all that wonderful stuff. So I'm looking forward to it. So thanks.
My pleasure being here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, of course. So before we just kind of get into it, just tell folks who you are, what you do, what you study, what you research, and all of that wonderful stuff.
Yeah, so my name is Daniel Sznycer, and I'm an evolutionary social psychologist. I have various lines of research on emotions, social emotions, including shame, pride, anger, envy, and others. Valuation, how people value other people, but also things, events, states of affairs, and how those things might explain morality and institutions. So those are my research areas. And I'm currently an assistant professor of psychology at Oklahoma State University.
Yeah. How long have you been teaching there, or has it been a couple years or a long time, or
like 6 months? I'm a new.
Okay. Where were you before?
Before I was at the University of Montreal.
Okay.
For 4 years. Yes.
Got it. Okay.
I've done postdocs at Arizona State University and the University of California, Santa Barbara, where I did my PhD too.
Yeah, nice, very nice. Well, I think you're kind of the right person to talk about this stuff, and so we'll get into a lot of it. One of the things that I haven't done this intentionally. I think it just kind of happened that way.
I think emotion research is super important. And, many folks that have, a PhD in clinical psych or any type of psychology kind of go off and do their own things and study or talk about different things. And, my own, brief, movements into research was studying shame. And I just love studying emotions and self-conscious emotions. And so I've kind of slipped back into that. So I have more and more conversations with researchers and writers and philosophers that think about emotions. And so it's becoming a theme now. So you'll be a wonderful addition to that long list of guests that have been talking about emotions. So let's talk about anger first. I think we can talk about maybe two major ones, and then we can get into maybe kind of the more broad types of things. It might seem strange to do it that way, but I actually think that makes more sense, because then a lot of these things will just kind of point back to. So you recently wrote a paper on the recalibration theory of anger. Is this right?
Yep.
And so why don't we just start with, we'll touch on that, but let's talk about first anger. So what is anger, and how specifically is social valuation kind of a major part of anger? So just kind of set us up for that.
Great. So this is the anger master is my colleague and friend Aaron Sell. He's the master of all things anger and aggression and hatred. And I have several collaborations with him, but he's the master here of the anger line. Mm-hmm. But so in anger, his hypothesis is that anger is a neurocognitive machine that has a front end that detects, so the trigger of anger would be indications, behavioral indications, acts or actions or inactions from others that indicate to you that others value your welfare less than you feel they should value your welfare. Mm. It's not just mistreatment or maltreatment or low concern, because, for example, you might imagine strangers on the street might not be willing to help you, but you don't get angry at that. That's because you don't expect them to value you highly to begin with. But with a friend, you do, for example, and so you might be moving to your new apartment and you need help, and you ask them for help, 2 hours moving boxes or something like that, and they say, or you need to go to the hospital and you need help of that sort. That's very important for you. And they say, nah, you know what, that's fine, but I'd rather stay home and watch some TV, some reruns of some old TV show. And you get angry at that, and the indication there is that the transaction would have been a huge benefit to you. They're not willing to sacrifice even a small amount foregoing that old TV show for the sake of helping you. And so that triggers anger. Mm. And the idea here is that anger is a machine that, metaphorically speaking, what it does is it tries to reach into the other person's brain and recalibrate upwards how much they value, how much weight they place on your welfare. So these, it has basically two ways to do that. One is the route of benefits, bargain with costs and benefits. We can have other people do what we want by threatening them or actually imposing on them costs through aggressive imposition of costs. And the other route where that we can bargain with is benefits. We give other people benefits. We're capable of generating benefits. And if you withhold those benefits that you would otherwise give those people, then so you threaten them or you actually don't help them. So, hey, help me this time because, I've been nice to you this and this way. And if you don't help me now, then you can forget about my willingness to help in the future. And so that's how anger bargains. There's a preliminary stage where anger, there may be the mistaken or naive or false view that anger is about aggression and punching. So I get angry, I punch.
Mm-hmm.
But people don't do that for the most part. Sometimes anger does lead to aggression, but anger, the first stage in anger is high curiosity and really wanting to know if the other person really knows just how much you value the thing. So if you tell your friend, hey, do you know that it's my mother that is at the hospital? I really need help. You driving me to the hospital or taking care of my child while I go to the hospital or whatever it might be. And your friend might say, oh, I'm really sorry. I thought it was you going to do shopping or something like that, but it's your mother. Of course, I will take care of your child. So then anger can cheaply, you don't need to go to higher stakes and more dangerous bargaining stages. You can resolve the conflict. It's an issue of miscalibration and lack of information, and the resolution of the situation can be done cheaply and easily. So there's a lot of information exchange with anger. Now, of course, if your friend says, yeah, I know it's your mother who's at the hospital and I really don't care, I'd rather watch the reruns of the show, then anger may escalate to a more purely bargaining thing. So that's in a nutshell the theory of anger.
Yeah. So I guess that's great how you kind of lay it out and march us through the theory of it. I guess it might be somewhat not as intuitive for some folks that I think when people think of anger, yes, they think about I think what I would say the behaviors or the actions of anger. Someone gets upset, they, throw something across the room, they get up, they take it out on something or, hopefully not, but someone or whatever. They think of the actions or the behavior. And obviously that's not necessarily anger in and of itself. But what you're describing is interesting because I think that many people may, again, not initially see it this way, that there's a heavy social component of anger. Now, I don't want to kind of box you in and say, always or, never, or, only absolute statements, but is that always the case, right? So certainly we can feel anger if there's no social component, correct? Even if it, or is it just one of those things where it's like, well, let's say I'm in a room by myself and something happens. I read something or I see something or even maybe with myself, I can feel angry and there's no one around, but there's still the concept in my mind of, okay, I'm getting information from someone else or something else, and that's causing the anger. But so I guess my question is there always a social component to anger, or can you have anger and there is minimal or no social component?
Well, there's several possibilities there. There's the metaphor of getting angry at yourself. You are on a diet, you fail to diet, so there's only you and you're angry at yourself.
Sure.
Metaphors don't necessarily capture one-to-one the machine in the brain. So I would call that maybe not exactly anger. That's maybe more of a metaphor than the anger system. But yes, you may be alone in the room and you may, in intercouple mode or in imagination or recall, you may recall situations where your friend failed to help you or insulted you, or you eavesdropped on him telling someone else that he thinks that you're lazy or ungenerous or something like that, and that may trigger anger even if he or she is not in the room. Mm-hmm. So it does trigger cognition and yes, in preparatory mode. But the other thing that you said, I think, is very important, which is that it's not just a behavioral emotions of actions and inactions. Maybe the zero order theory of anger is they punch me or they block my goals. I'm trying to go from A to B and they impede my trajectory, my movement, or they steal something from me and then I punch them. Anger is highly informational. You may think of anger as the ultimate goal of the machine is to have people value you and place weight on your welfare the highest that you can get from them based on your bargaining capacity relative to their bargaining capacity. Ideally, if you were God and you were infinitely powerful, you would have everyone in your social environment treat you with maximum respect, maximum deference. Everyone would consult before doing anything what you want. And so everybody would be trying to please you and so on. Although if you are God, then you don't need other people to please you because you are God. Okay, but we are not God, unfortunately. And so we have some degree of bargaining with others. And so this is like a cold view of anger to try to understand it, to get out of the intentional stance and try to think the machine. And there's, of course, other machinery that inclines us to care about others and so on. But it may be useful to think about what the machine is doing by itself. And so you may want everyone to treat you to maximum respect. You can't. Okay, and different dyads, you with respect to your friend, you with respect to your boss. So there's many people in your environment. The differential bargaining capacity of each dyad with you with respect to other people is different depending on who the other is. But there's some equilibrium that you can get other people to value you, every specific other person. So if from your friend Tony, you expect and you think you can get from him, let's say 7 units of goodness out of him, then that would be the equilibrium that you expect him to treat you with, a valuation of 7, whatever 7 might mean. And so anger is, so in the long run, the goal may be to harvest maximum valuation from others. And valuation translates, yes, behaviorally in terms of the good things that other people will do for you and the negative things that might benefit them, but they might refrain from doing because they attach way to your welfare. So the more people value you, and that this is general to other emotions, not just anger, but gratitude, shame, and so on, the more people value you, the better for you, because they will be more likely to do good things for you and less likely to do negative, exploitative things for you. And so going back to anger, if you have indications that your friend Tony is treating with a valuation of 3 or 2 when he could be treating you at a 7 point, then anger is deployed and anger bargains. But the important thing here is that even though ultimately you may think of the anger machine as a machine to extract maximum benefits, given the constraints of your relative bargaining power, and minimize the position of cost from others to yourself, in the more proximate sense, anger is a highly informational machine. And this is super important to say. And to give an example of intuitive example of how this might work is, imagine 2 situations where your friend Tony imposes the same exact cost on you. So he wipes his mouth, he ruins your beautiful scarf or your beautiful shirt, Italian silk shirt, by wiping his mouth of ketchup. Mm-hmm. He ruins your clothing. And so in the 2 situations, he does the exact same action, which costs you exactly the same thing, the 400 scarf or whatever. But in one case, he does it to wipe his mouth. In the other case, he destroys your shirt by using it as a tourniquet to save his daughter's life. Mm. So the exact same cost, if it's done to derive very high benefits in the saving his daughter's life case, then the ratio of benefits to costs in the second case, the tourniquet, is from an informational standpoint, it's an indication that his underlying valuation of you is not necessarily too low. That transaction is also consistent with him valuing you very highly. It's just that the benefit to him was so enormous that he might impose costs on you. And intuitively, you see that. So the fact that when you ask people how angry would you get in the first versus second case, people may say, well, in the second case, I would get much less angry. The first case, it would piss me off massively. Second case, really, of course, I would give him the shirt. And so that suggests that it's not just about the cost. Mm-hmm. If it were about cost impositions and goal blockage and so on, mm-hmm. then people would robotically pay attention to these behaviors and actions. But that's very much not what anger does. Mm-hmm. Anger is about inference about the internal valuation that other people hold towards you and recalibration. And likewise, you don't need goal blockage or breaking vases or expensive objects at all for anger to be elicited.
Sure.
There's transactions where there's no cost imposition at all, and anger is triggered nonetheless. So if you overhear your friend talking to somebody else and you eavesdrop that they think poorly of you, that triggers anger, because if they misestimate or they underestimate how good you are at different traits, generosity, how strong you are, how intelligent you are, and so on, they think you're low on all of those things, then you may get angry at them, even when they haven't imposed any cost for you, zero cost. And nevertheless, you have informational cues that suggest the logic. It's a very deductive and beautiful logic, I think. My friend Aerosol outlined and mapped out many puzzles of this anger machine, and it's very deductive and beautiful. The logic is there's all these factors that determine how much people value other people: intelligence, skills, generosity, allies, and this and that. And if you have indications that people underestimate how high you are on any of those things, then that predicts that then they will treat you with less respect or deference and caring than you actually have based on those traits.
So it's dependent on the attributions that the person is making based on those traits.
Yes, it is a cue, and it's predictive. There's an implicit prediction of filling in the blank that the anger machine does. You can think of it as making a prediction. If they think, so I'm 7 intelligent, and they are telling other people that I'm 2 intelligent, that I'm a dumb person. And okay, why should I care that they think I'm dumb? Whatever, if they think I'm dumb. It's intuitively obvious to us that we get angry at those things, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can say whatever, they think that I'm dumb. I know I'm not dumb. Whatever, that's fine. I can do nothing about that, or I can tell them simply, hey, I'm not dumb. Or I can go and solve some math problem to show them that I'm not dumb, and period. There's no need to do anger. There's no need to do aggression. So there's 1,000 alternative universes in which that doesn't trigger anger at all, especially when they haven't blocked any goals, they haven't destroyed any property, and so on. But nevertheless, we intuitively get angry at those things. And so to explain that, we need something, and that something might be something like the anger system or other inference engines in the head make the inference that they underestimate how good I'm at factor X that determines how much other people value other people. If they underestimate me on factor X, then the downstream summary valuation that they will deploy towards me, everything else equal, is going to be lower than I'm actually worth. Okay? And therefore, so anger is running all these simulations and anticipating the future before they have the opportunity. So it's a very clever, and it's like Geico, calling can save you 15% more. Anger saves you the trouble of getting to the point where they are disrespecting you in public, or that they're not doing you this terrible favor that you truly need, and it costs them very little. So it anticipates, and it says, okay, hey, please correct this. I'm not dumb. I have average intelligence. So you need to treat me better.
So I have a few questions here on this. So there's 2 main ones, I think. So the first question is, a lot of this process I actually have more questions, but a lot of this process seems to be, I don't want to say unconscious, right? Because that's kind of, loaded with many things, but people aren't aware that the machine aspects of this are going on. We feel,
exactly,
right? The colloquial feel anger, right? We, your blood rushes, your heart beats faster, you can feel it, we have the physiological or the sensational kinds of things with anger, right? But a lot of the times people aren't knowing all of this other kind of background noise, or not want to say noise, but all these background kinds of elements that are going on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, that's a general feature of mental life and adaptations, well-designed mental machinery in general, you get the phenomenological conscious outputs of these things, but you don't have access to the underlying operations of the machine. And that's good enough for an organism to operate in that way.
Mm-hmm.
The organism doesn't really, it's only if you are doing scientific analysis of this piece of machinery, but for an organism, it's good enough to act in the way that the machinery, on average, would have been designed to solve different problems. Anger to bargain for better valuation, language to communicate with others, vision to analyze scenes based on reflected light, and so on.
And so in this way, then, that a lot of this is dependent on the individual that is becoming angry based on what they're receiving from the environmental or contextual input for them, what they're maybe feeling and or then doing after that. It seems in terms of this, in terms of what you're discussing about the information and how they're trying to evaluate where things are with the situation, it seems dependent on whatever that particular person's Bayesian priors are. So whatever they're trying to do, they are trying to confirm or disconfirm, again, unbeknownst to them. Okay, where is this, this person, I'm upset, but, this has less of a cost to me. Okay, so I don't need to act on this or whatever. And in another situation that may be super important to do that. How much of that is, I guess, a factor here?
Yes, priors and evidence and updating is very important here because different priors have elicit anger or not, depending on your priors. Again, failure to drive you to the hospital brings about anger with respect to a friend, but not to a stranger. So priors are important, and there's the issue of clarifying information and updating how much they value you. So it could be one outcome of anger could be you have a lot of clarifying information that they really don't value your welfare. One possible outcome of anger might be terminating the relationship. One is bargaining. There's the famous, the folk notion of the 7 stages of anger and grief. Uh-huh. One outcome of anger is you may try to recalibrate them, and recalibration is expensive, but it's an investment in a relationship in a way. So anger, like hatred, in hatred, the goal is elimination of an enemy, someone who is incorrigible in your estimation. They emit many costs. They won't recalibrate, and it's impossible to remove them, and they're resistant to recalibration. And so an enemy may, in the logic of hatred, the hatred machine aims to neutralize or remove or eliminate this fitness suppressor. But in anger, it's investment in the relationship, so to speak. The relationship would be at a higher level of equilibrium and synergy if you can move the other person higher and you high with them. And but if there's a lot of clarifying evidence suggesting that the other is not interested in doing that, then one of the possible outcomes of anger is relationship dissolution. And
that makes a lot of intuitive sense, actually, because there is a type of investment of, well, if you're going to put all this energy out, you would probably want to do that in this context of for something that you want to maintain or establish or build or whatever. I guess in terms of anger about the, I guess you could say the expression of it, right? So I want to get to kind of the evolutionary components here, but before I do that, I guess many times people will feel anger or will experience anger, I should say, but they don't do anything with it, right? It stays what we say, bottled up, right? And you just build, and no one is letting it out, so to speak, right? And then there are other folks that do that too much, and they let it out too often and too frequently with no breaks on and things like that. I guess what can you say about, I guess this might become more of a personality question or a temperament question or personality traits or things like that. But I guess in terms of the, reduction or the, explosion of the expression of anger, or, what can you say about that?
So that's a very interesting question. And the general theory of the nature of the anger machine led my colleague and friend Aracel to hypothesize about individual differences in anger. So one approach is to look at individual differences, and there's other approaches. In the within person approach, you yourself, you have a given bargaining capacity, a given amount of strength and allies and weaponry and assets that you can withhold from other people to bargain with. But then there's different people in the scene that you may be bargaining with. You're bargaining with your boss, your friend, an acquaintance, and so on. So it may be intuitive or easy to see when you're bargaining with your boss or you're angry at your boss, it may be imprudent to maybe disclose the anger or to get too angry because there's harsh consequences. And so you can see there's within person variation that can be perhaps lawfully explained in terms of this model. But there's also between person factors, these will be personality differences in level of anger. And so the prediction here would be that people who on average are more capable of imposing costs on others through aggression, for example, or alternatively, people who are more capable of bargaining through the removal of benefits because they are highly capable to produce those benefits to begin with, then those people would be more prone to experience anger and to manifest the anger and to bargain with outward manifest anger. And that's what Aracel found in a paper in 2009 with Toby and Cosmides. They found that among males were with higher upper body strength, they measure the circumference of the flex bicep as a measure operationalization of the concept of the biology relevant variable is the rate at which you can sustain cost in combat between two individuals. That's the technical biological definition. But quick operationalization was to measure the circumference of the flex bicep. And they also measure people pumping weight in the gym and so on. But with the circumference of the flex bicep, you can get a decent amount of variance in the fighting strength of people. Not necessarily that. Anyway, and the bottom line is that the stronger the man is, males, as measured by the bicep, the more these males report that they themselves are prone to anger and that they feel more entitled to better outcomes in life and that they have more of a history of aggression and physical violence in interpersonal conflicts and so on. So this may explain individual differences in anger deployment and expression.
Yeah, it's very fascinating. I've heard some of these things, and obviously testosterone is probably a big component to that, although not only the only piece included in that. Kind of along those lines, I kind of just wanted to ask. We didn't talk about it directly, but what is I guess the traditional evolutionary theory or adaptation model of how we understand anger? So you've been talking about the recalibration theory. So how much does that fit with how we understand the evolutionary models of anger, or does not fit? How can you explain some of the framework that we understand anger there?
I think at the moment, this recalibrational theory of anger would be best, if not the best available models to understand anger from an evolutionary perspective, I would say. I don't know if it's universally accepted, but in my own estimation, it's the best thing we have.
I think for many people, what it sounds like is that it's building off of kind of very loose ways of understanding. Emotions are there to help us survive, so that way we don't get harmed, et cetera, and that's kind of the basic evolutionary model for many emotions, anger included. And I would imagine you see this in other primates, and you see this in other animals. And so you laying out this recalibration theory just seems to notch it up to 11, right, of all of the different costs and the trade-off ratio and things like that. That's what it seems like.
Yeah, it has the theory is beautiful, I think, and it's very conciliant with the rest of what we know about animal behavior and organic design in general. So these the history of bargaining by aggressively imposing costs is very ancient, and other animal species do it. Physical combat is common in the animal kingdom. There's a logic to combat. It's not just blind combat, but it's highly regulated because it's not good for, if you know, and it's also highly informational. If you have you have a conflict or a resource, an indivisible resource with another person, or you're a lion or a horse or whatever you are, there's a piece of food, and either of you get the food. If one gets it, the other doesn't get it, and vice versa. So you're in conflict. Resources are good for reproduction. There's a logic of conflict, which is that those who value the resource the most, or those who sustain bodily injury at a lower rate, are more likely to enter the contest. And so contests happen when it's not clear yet who values the resource the most, or who's the stronger one, more formidable. As soon as it becomes apparent who is clearly stronger than the other, then the weaker one withdraws. And because it's better, the logic is it's better to get zero resource than to lose a resource and get zero, but also get injury or death. And so conflict within species is highly regulated. Not so between species, lions eating zebras, that's okay. But within species, it's highly regulated, but it happens. And so anyway, this anger theory in humans it's consistent with the rest of animal behavior, and it has other implications for, and there's an extremely interesting and foundational theory of why to use aggression in the first place. Animals and organisms in general are super highly organized pieces of machinery made out of dead matter. So life is dead matter that is highly organized. The type of atoms that constitute us are the same type of atoms that constitute dead things. It's just that by arranging them in incredibly unlikely orders in molecules, then you get life. But so life is dead matter improbably organized and arranged in a highly non-random and functional way. But one corollary of that is that it takes disarrangement. If you disorganize someone, then they die. It's 1 millimeter damage to the brain or to the heart will cause your death. And that's something that organisms evolved to implicitly know, even if they don't understand the rationale. And so they can bargain with that for things, bargain by the threat or the neutrality of aggression. So anger is consistent with all these chain of causation, animal behavior, life, biochemical engineering, and then there's upwards, or I don't know if you want to go say upwards or whatever, but there's implications for culture and institutions. We have a paper with Aaron on trying to understand how anger informs the criminal justice system. So there's many analogies in the criminal justice system between anger, a machine for bargaining between two people, and this massive mammoth institution of the criminal justice system, which is incredibly complicated. Yeah. There's many people involved, massive amounts of resources, but many features of the criminal justice system can be understood in terms of anger.
Yeah. No, I think the way you outline it is wonderful. I think it's important to understand kind of I guess you could say bottom up, way of understanding how the hierarchies of this work. I guess two quick questions about anger, and then we can switch to shame. Is this is true for emotions in general, and I guess I'm bringing it up here because of anger gets a kind of it's not the poster child for emotions, right? Most people see anger as a negative thing. They see it as a bad thing, and there's a lot of moral and value judgment placed on anger, right? It's the thing you don't want. It's the thing that's gets in the way. It's destructive. All these things. So I guess in a general sense, would it be safe to assume that you probably aren't fond of the positive versus negative emotions kind of dichotomy, and in fact that anger has many pro-social and many adaptive and many positive, if you will, or healthy functions to it? Would you be, agree to say that, or do you have some other way of viewing it?
Yes, I think I don't like the positive emotion, negative emotion distinction. I think it's okay for certain purposes, but I think the fundamental question here is good for whom and what's the nature of the machine. If you start from the assumption that some emotions may have more detrimental cost for societies or for societal harmony or something like that, then that's fine to say that anger emits more of those than generosity and gratitude or something like that. But then these machines are not designed, we believe, based on the evidence, they don't evolve for the good of society and for societal harmony. So tagging anger or shame, as shame has also been deemed a negative, maladaptive, ugly emotion, just because it doesn't lead to outcomes that we researchers prefer when we look at society, I think that's a fallacy, and that's bad thinking. I mean, it's useful to think in that way if you want to do some societal analysis. But that's not how the machine works, or the generative process that creates the machine is not about the society. It's about the replication of the machine itself and the particles of design of the machine itself. And once you shift that view, the good for society versus the good of the replicating machine itself, then you find a zoo or whatever your analogy, a panorama or a landscape of incredibly beautifully designed machinery and design features that are exquisitely well designed for the purpose of what the machine is doing. That serves very well the function of replicating the machine itself. And anger is full of those, and shame is full of those. And so that change of view leads to a change in perspective. And those things are not necessarily contradictory. The anger system, there's many things that are self-replicating, aggression and many other things that are evolutionarily stable strategies, and they lead to negative societal outcomes, and there's no contradiction in those things. So it's very important to understand or to think good for whom. Once you ask that, then the puzzle or the mystery dissolves, I think.
No, I fully agree with you on this point. So last thing here is the cross-cultural aspects of anger. I think you have a paper, I can't remember with whom, about
with
the cross-cultural aspects of anger. So this kind of gets into something we may touch on later, but many people will speculate about what's the taxonomy of anger, how do we define it, what are its dimensions, what are its boundaries, and how does anger in weird populations, right, it looks one way maybe, but what about in non-weird populations and around the world and in different communities and culture and tribes and groups, etc. So I guess what can we confidently say about anger? I don't want to say universally, but right, but across many cultures, what are the things that we see that are similar, and maybe other components of it that are not so similar?
Yeah, so there's many open questions here, but there's been some questions that have been addressed cross-culturally, and cross-culturally is a handful of societies. Again, you may say, well, 5 societies is nothing compared to the thousands of countries that ever existed. So, okay. So, as much as I like cross-cultural research, it's kind of still pathetically underpowered in the sense of 15 societies or even 20 or 40, it's nothing, but still, okay. So Aaron led a team of people, and he found that some core features of the anger machine appear to be similar, at least in the direction of the effects across cultures, including one forager horticulturalist society in the Ecuadorian Amazon, the Shuar. And so, for example, if a given cost is imposed on you for a large benefit derived by the offender, so the offender ruins your scarf, but it's to save his daughter's life as opposed to wipe his mouth, then that decreases the amount of anger that you feel. So that's a cross-culturally replicated finding. There's also intuitions that people, from the offender perspective, where you mistreat someone else, and the victim perspective, the victim is deploying the anger aimed at recalibrating the offender. And from the two perspectives, there's arguments, anger-based arguments. So why did you do that to me? Didn't you know that it was a beautiful scarf? No, what you talking about? You bought the scarf for $2 at the Salvation Army. And so there's one thing that anger does is arguments between offenders and victims, and there's rapid, rich information exchanges. And the way that offenders, the underlying grammar of anger through which offenders and victims argue when the victim is in anger conforms to the underlying grammar of anger. So victims in anger, they argue that the cost imposed on them was very high. So this scarf was the one, there's not one like that in the whole universe. Did you know that? So the manifestation is different, but the underlying logic is the cost is very high. The benefit that you derive was very low. You could have used the napkin. Why did you use my scarf? And also you knew that it was my scarf as opposed to perhaps being mistakenly in the mistaken belief that it was someone else's scarf. And offenders trying to diffuse that need to recalibrate. Sometimes they do accept the pricing for recalibration and they recalibrate. But in general, offenders argue, if you ask offenders what would make a good case in their case, they argue the reverse, that the cost wasn't too high after all, that the benefit derived by them was actually higher. They really needed to wipe their mouths because they had a presentation, job presentation. It was very important. And sorry, I know it was a cost, but it was really important. There was no napkin. And finally, that they didn't really know that it was theirs. So, and these features of anger-based arguments are also replicated across cultures. And there's other elements of anger replicated or conducted by Ekman in most societies. People can tell the anger expression and so on.
Yeah.
There's many things to be determined, but there's some pieces of the puzzle that are there with at least some cultures, populations.
I guess the follow-up I have here is a kind of devil's advocate for folks that have an alternative kind of view on this is, well, what about elements like, culture, and what about elements of social norms, and what about certain morals or things like that? Maybe anger is different in those ways. And so I guess two questions on that is even if those things are true, and they most certainly are, that doesn't deny the fact that anger is still an underlying emotion that's occurring, even if people have different cultures and norms and morals and things like that. So there is, at least from the data that's available, and as we, people do more research, you may find new things, but it does seem that there is, in other cultures, this underlying component of, anger is a way of trying to have some type of interaction with others or some type of valuation or things like that. So I guess how much of all of the social components, again, culture, norms, morals, etc., how much of that is a distractor, or is it something that's implicated or not, or it's not a relevant variable? How does those kinds of things, and again, that will be dependent on each culture, but just in the general abstract, how much does that come into play for understanding, I guess, anger?
It depends on who you ask. There's different views, including the view that culture is and social norms are all important and all determinative, and there is some truth to that. To some extent, not to the all-important extent, but there's people who attach more weight to the issue of culture than other people do, and there's everything in the middle. But I would say that my own way of thinking is that complex adaptations such as anger and shame and other things in general, they have an innate architecture specified by genes, the part that is unlearned, and then a ton of open parameters and also environmental inputs. You need to eat in order and grow a brain to have anger to begin with. If you don't have a brain, if you don't eat, you don't have a brain, you don't have anger. And a lot of open parameters in the kind of things that people value. The kinds of things that people value are across different ecologies and populations and social ecologies will be important in determining the manifest form of anger, because if element X, imagine whatever, a piece of paper, is absolutely not valued in a given culture, but it's a piece of money in another culture, and there's a social institution that a piece of paper is actually conferred a lot of value in some cultures, but in another culture is nothing, then you may have very rich and very important differences across populations that are self-replicating, that are not genetic or not strictly genetic. And so you can call that a cultural theory of anger. So I think that's entirely true and possible, and I think that's we need to explain those cultural differences in anger. At the same time, however, my suspicion, and we need much more research to know, but my suspicion is that we will find that there are some conceptual primitives and variables and modes of operation that underlie anger that transcend populations and space, time, ecology, religion, language, and whatnot. Mm-hmm. For example, everything else equal, the higher the benefit derived by the offender from the offense, the lesser the anger, because there's in the logic of anger, that kind of transaction where the offender is highly benefited by the scarf, maybe saving his daughter's life, that is not an indication of low valuation, and therefore that triggers anger less. And I think those, at that level of analysis, at that level of conceptual depth, I think there's going to be a ton of universals, simply because the anger machine is, in theory, part of human nature, found everywhere.
Yeah. Okay, so from anger, obviously, anger is it's what we call the basic emotions, right? But it's interesting how you're describing anger as there's so much social valuation in it, right? Which is, most people see a whole other category of, social, or what we call self-conscious emotions, guilt, shame, embarrassment, pride. But it seems like there is some overlap there. And some people will say pride is a basic emotion, right? It's not just a self-conscious emotion. So it's interesting how we categorize these emotions and what's the features of them. I want to ask you about shame. So you've written about shame. I think you've written a few papers with my friend Laith. Laith is a good guy. He's very awesome. He's awesome. He's extremely brilliant. And he's a very good writer, and he's a very, very good teacher. And so he can explain things very, very well. And so we had a nice conversation last year. He's great. He's great. So I guess let me just ask just a general thing, just to kind of know where you're coming from, and then we'll get into some of the finer points. Just how do you define shame? How do you see where it sits within emotions and some of the main features? And just kind of tell us kind of how you're coming at shame.
Yes, so if in anger the problem is they're valuing you less than what you feel entitled to from them, in shame the problem is that it is possible or likely, or it's actually happening, that some information about you will become, or may become, or is actually becoming known by others, and specifically negative information. And that negative information, when it reaches the brain of others, causes others to devalue you. And therefore you have trouble. You have a big problem now, because they're going to be less inclined to render you help and favors and so on, and more inclined to take self-beneficial actions that might harm you and respect you less and so on. So in short, you can call that devaluation. They will devalue you if they learn that you're not very generous, or that you took the last slice of pizza and you didn't leave any pizza for the hungry members of the group, or you don't have skills, or whatever it might be. And so shame, in theory, in the hypothesis, is the machine that natural selection crafted to deal with this problem. Or one important first line of defense is the problem of being devalued by others.
So I guess the big thing here is, so I had a conversation with Owen Flanagan a couple months ago, and we had this interesting conversation about, he's great. We had this he's very thoughtful in many places. He kind of resists a little bit this idea of the global self. Now, the standard definition of shame is when others are perceiving certain things that the person is having this idea of their global self as being inadequate or not sufficient. And so there's kind of the image I always use is that, someone wants to kind of just sink into a hole in the ground, right? Their whole total self is not a value or worth, or that there's something really deficient in some ways in terms of how they view the self. Now, you kind of have to have a larger, I guess you could say, ontological discussion or a conversation about what is the self. And people, philosophers and neuroscientists, argue about, is there a self? Is an illusion? What makes up that? But I guess we can have that conversation if you want. But I guess my question would be, how much do you kind of lean or put weight on this idea that, intrinsic to the definition of shame, that it has to attack the global self? Does it not have to? How much of the kind of global self, or just the self, is important for understanding, I guess, shame as an emotion?
Yes, that's a great question. So to clarify a bit for those who are listening to this, the global self idea and shame is an idea that comes from attributional theories of shame and guilt, which are hugely important and influential in outlining and explaining what shame and guilt and other emotions such as pride are. And so June Tangney and Jess Tracy, they have argued that they have focused heavily on the contrast between shame and guilt. And they have argued that the contrast between shame and guilt, people in the past have argued that shame is public and guilt is private. And that's not the best way to put this, I think, but there's something to it. Or that there are different types of emotions triggered by different type of events. And maybe mentation and cognition. And June Tangney in the 90s, she argued, no, there's really no difference between shame and guilt that is driven by different types of events or different amounts of publicity. And furthermore, it's not at all the case that shame has more to do with concerns about reputation damage than guilt is. Not at all. There may be reputational concerns with guilt, and there may be private shame, and so on. So if triggering events and reputational concerns and those kind of things are really not the causal difference, guilt, then what is the difference? And the difference, their answer is that the difference between shame and guilt is the way that you, the self, interprets a negative event. In plain English, we can say a mess up or a screw up. So there's some screw up, and if you think that the cause of the screw up is you, not someone else, or not an accident or an act of God or something, but something about you, and moreover, you attribute or you interpret that cause of that screw up as having been generated by your whole self, okay? Something about who you are, something that is stable and uncontrollable about yourself, the kind of person that you are or that you want to be, okay, and that's very stable about you, okay? Okay, then that's shame. And if it's changeable and it's focal and it's more of an action that is revisable and changeable and unstable and controllable, then that's more guilt, okay? So that's the origins of the stable self and shame. And they have a lot of evidence agreeing or supporting that distinction. Now, I believe that evidence is very strong. We are having a paper coming out with Mitchell Landers and Patrick Durkee, the first experimental evidence contrasting attributions. We cause people to generate different attributions for a given bad action, for example, causing harms to others. And the way that people, the way that these attributions are happening are not at all a differential trigger of shame versus guilt. So basically, to try to summarize this long discussion, because people may not be too interested.
No, it's great. It's great. It's great.
Details of the shame theories is that the evidence in favor of that global self theory of shame has been correlational. There hasn't been a strong experimental theory on that. And we produced that experimental evidence and a cross-cultural pre-registered experiments, and we have very strong support for an evolutionary functional interpersonal theory of shame and guilt, where what other people think of you or what you feel about other people is crucially and cardinally important for shame and guilt. Whereas in the attributional theories of shame by Jess Tracy and John Tangney, it's really about the self, how the self interprets the self's own actions and how the self judges the self. So if you think your whole self is tainted and is problematic, then that feels super bad because your whole self is tainted and contaminated and defective. And therefore you feel terrible because it's kind of a spatial metaphor. It's better, it's bad if you do something bad, but it's less bad if the self that is compromised is 10% or 5% of the self. Mm-hmm. Whereas if the whole self, if the global self, if the 100% of the self is compromised, then that's worse. And worse is worse than less worse. And therefore, in shame, the pain of having the whole self compromised is so big that it's such a bummer, to put it in plain English, that the self remains impaired to take reparative action. So people hide, people do all these negative things that are terrible. Mm-hmm. As a footnote, I would say they're terrible from the standpoint of victims who expect and would prefer reparative action. So if I steal from you and I hide, okay, so now let's transition to the functional interpersonal viewpoint of shame and guilt. Yeah. If I steal from you, stealing from you is good. Because if I steal money from you, I get $100 that I stole from you. So stealing from you benefits me. So I am $100 richer. Right. Now, stealing from you is also bad for me because if you find me, then you're going to devalue me and you're going to report me to the police and I may go to jail and so on. And other people may devalue me as well. Mm-hmm. So, but stealing is good and bad. Okay, if I steal from you and then I hear I'm by myself at the room, there's your $100, I steal the money, there's no one in the room, and then I hear footsteps approaching the office or the place, and I hide in shame, such that I take the escape route and I flee with your $100 and you don't discover me, and there's no recording cameras. That's a kind of a new accoutrements or contraptions of the modern evolutionary novel things. But so ancestrally, it would be I steal a piece of meat or your tools or your arrowheads, and I flee, and you don't discover me. And so, is fleeing bad? Because fleeing is bad, and hiding in shame is bad from your perspective. That's for sure. That's kind of obvious. That's clear. It may also be bad from the perspective of third parties or societies or people who would think, hey, if I can put myself in this guy is a thief and I put myself in their shoes and it's a bad guy. On the other hand, from my own perspective, of course, hiding is good because it's better to have, like in the animals who withdraw from the fight, it's better for me to have the $100 and the lack of devaluation than to have the $100 and you catch me and you punish me and you take the $100 from me. So hiding is highly functional in shame. Okay, I think in the simple case. Okay, then there's complications, but if you do a functional analysis, if you do an engineering analysis of the kind of things that people do in shame, you'll see that all of these behaviors, they are, again, I agree with Jun Tangni that those things are highly undesirable from the standpoint of society and maybe abstract morality, although I don't know. Anyway, but the key question again is good for whom?
Right.
Cui bono?
Yeah.
And from the standpoint of the replication of the shame machine, it's exactly what the machine needs to do. So there's a cultural, in human culture, there's an obsession in fiction, in narrative, in myth, and in superpower, that there's an obsession with invisibility. From Plato to the ring of Lord of the Rings to the invisibility cloak of Harry Potter. Right. There's an obsession with Invisible Man and Invisible Woman. There's an obsession with invisibility, and invisibility is exactly one thing. It's a cultural output of the shame system. Invisibility. One thing that invisibility does is to allow to perform self-beneficial, selfish actions, and also there's some things that give you shame that are not about harming others. They're incompetence, for example. I'm not benefited by my own incompetence, but it's simply that other people would devalue me if they learn that how dumb I am or how much I don't know, whereas I should know. But all of those things can be repaired or undone with invisibility. So short of invisibility, which unfortunately we don't have, or anyway, shame is the next best thing next to invisibility. So just for the one output of shame, which is hiding, if you do a simple 5-minute engineering analysis, it's exactly what it should be doing, and it does. So our theory and other people's theories regarding shame, a functional interpersonal theory, is that shame and guilt have everything to do with self and others. So I take issue with the moniker self-conscious emotion. I'm fine with that. I don't have any issues with that. You can call that, and I think that's an okay name. But also, self-conscious emotions are very much alternatively they could be termed other conscious emotions. Yeah. Because shame, for example, is extremely sensitive to what other people will think about you, and so. And I think this exclusive concern on the self is misguided, and it's wrong. It's factually wrong. I have some ideas why the phenomenology maybe of shame versus compared to guilt may feel more global and more stable and more negative and more painful. And I can tell you a little bit about that. But before going to that subtle thing, which I still don't know if it's true because I don't have data on that, but I can tell you something about shame and guilt. But shame, at least, and pride, for example, being other conscious emotions.
Okay.
So I've done studies around the world, including in small-scale societies, showing that. So I give people 20 or 25 negative hypothetical situations. For example, theft, involving theft. So someone steals from someone else. Someone is incompetent. Someone is stingy. Someone doesn't know how to cook. Okay, and then in a between subjects design, half of the people are told that this is true of themselves, and they're asked for each of these negative things how much shame they would feel if each of these things were true of themselves. And another group of people are told that someone else, not themselves, these things are true of someone else. How negatively would you view this someone else if each of these things were true of them? From 1 to 7, where 1 is not at all bad, to 7, I would view them very negatively. So that's a measure of devaluation, audience devaluation. What I find is very strong positive correlations between shame in the audience for a given disgraceful action or trait and the degree of devaluation in the audience expressed for that negative action or trait. In other words, the more a given audience, and audience are people, there's no different people. Everybody is an audience when we're witnessing other people doing disgraceful things. Disgraceful, which, by the way, might be advantageous for them or not, as the case might be. But we are both, our brains have machinery for punitively being punitive and moralistic audiences. And our brains have also machinery for defending ourselves against the wrath of others when they catch us red-handed doing bad things for them. Okay, and the finding is that for a given, so you can think of actions and traits and qualities and personal characteristics and so on as a price list. Okay, so being generous in America or in Baltimore or in Stillwater, Oklahoma, being generous has attached a value of 8.5, whatever the units might be. Mm-hmm. And it's probably not exactly a price list, a table with hard-coded entries, but there might be something like that in the brain. So generosity is something, skills, coding skills is worth 7.2, and cooking skills is worth 9.5, whatever. And then there's the range of negative. There's theft, there's arson, there's untruthfulness, there's betrayal, there's homicide, there's unintentional killing, there's premeditated killing, there's all the negative things that you can think of. And then for each of these things, the brain might compute some value, positive or negative. And the idea is that if shame is a defense against the threat of being devalued by others, and it's not just a mental threat, it's a mental threat, also you have a very concrete threat to your well-being. If other people think poorly of you, then they're going to be less inclined to help you, more inclined to exploit you, to shun you, to ostracize you. All of these are very tangible and very bad things that will happen to you if other people find out your disgraceful things. Then if shame is a defense against the threat of being devalued, then it's a general property, it's a well-engineered element of defenses to be well calibrated to the magnitude of the threat. And this is the Goldilocks principle, and it's a principle that you see in law enforcement, in the military, in engineering, in aviation, in anything that you can, where you have a problem and a trade-off, where too much of a good thing is a bad thing, and too little of a good thing is also a bad thing. So the defense is very closely calibrated to the magnitude of the threat. And the reason is that a defense, so it's the just right, like Goldilocks. If other people devalue you, or you anticipate that they're going to devalue you by -9, let's say, to give a simple numerical example, it's good to have shame in preparation and also in reaction. There's the preparatory mode of shame and the reaction mode of shame. If people have seen you versus you're stealing, but people haven't seen you, so you have the preemptive anticipatory shame. But anyway, in either of these modes, it's good to have the shame response to help you, for example, escape or destroy incriminating evidence, or to hide, or to have a ready-made excuse why. Now this is tying back to anger. So shame and anger and all of these social emotions are extremely logically linked to each other, linked by the underlying logic of valuation. So you might appeal, let's say you're stealing $100 from me, where you are the candidate for shame, and I'm going to be the candidate for anger. And so if my own anger is assuaged by me convincingly learning that you needed those $100 not to drink beer, for example, but to save your daughter's life, then my anger is assuaged, is diminished. My devaluation is diminished. And so shame may prepare in mental template mode, preparatory mode, an excuse that you really need those $100, in addition to maybe hiding and so on. So, but there's an additional question of how much of the defense if the defense of shame can be boiled down to a single scalar, a single magnitude. Very much prepare and hide and never return to the group in shame, or a little bit such that you escape, but then you return to the group and pretend nothing happened, or nothing at all, or all the way in between. And the basic engineering solution would be to tailor shame to the precise estimated in preparatory mode magnitude of the devaluation, because you can do two errors in shame. One error is if you're shameless and you don't deploy the shame, then you're going to be caught stealing the $100 and you're going to get devaluation from others. So under deploying shame for a given for a given magnitude of devaluation is a bad idea. It's a costly error. But on the other hand, over deploying shame, imagine that for every slight transgression that you do, you're at ceiling for shame. So you hide and you never return to society. Okay, so you are in that way you are saving yourself the cost of being devalued by others, but also you are unwittingly or as a side effect imposing yourself huge amounts of costs. The cost of secluding yourself and not getting the benefits of society. So you see, in shame activation, there's a trade-off, and therefore the general solution is shame should be tailored to the amount of devaluation for a given action or trait. And that's exactly what we find. There's two groups, people giving their shame for different actions. They've never seen the audience. They're not even told that in this study there's other people giving audience reactions. And the amount of shame that people give for burning the food and stealing this and being stingy and sexual infidelity and not knowing how to dance and not having skills and so on is very closely linked to the magnitude of devaluation from the audience in the exact way that you expect. The more audience devaluation for a given thing, the more shame. And we find this in societies around the world over and over and over. Industrial societies, we have a paper with 15 small-scale traditional societies, many of which are off the grid, forager societies, small-scale societies without internet, so people in herders in Mongolia, in the steppes of Mongolia, people, Shuar hunter horticulturalists from the Ecuadorian Amazon, people from Nepal, people from the from Ikland in Uganda. And you find you can even plot the shame of the Mongolians against the devaluation of the Shuar, and you find strikingly super high correlations. To put it in plain English, what you find is that the more a given disgraceful act or trait, for example, stealing from others, is devalued among the Shuar of Ecuador, if they see another person stealing, the more herders from Mongolia feel shame themselves if that theft was true of themselves, if they were the thief. And that's kind of spooky because it's like, from the pure cultural perspective, it's like maybe for this to happen, the two simple alternatives would be the following. Number one, the pure cultural hypothesis is the Mongolians learned somehow the values of the Shuar, or conversely, the Shuar learned the values of the Mongolians. There's nothing intrinsic to human nature that can compute these things. Then there's something about, and it's all about social norms constructed culturally with no rhyme or reason, or in divorce from other social norms and cultures. Then you expect free variation, and there's no reason to expect variation. The correlation would be found if one culture learned from the other culture and also gave their reports based on those cultures. So many coincidences have to happen. It's not possible, and it could happen. After all, I mean, I'm from Argentina, and we've watched many Hollywood movies, so we know a lot about America. And that's how we may have acquired our values. Alternatively, it could be an innate theory, or what I think is more likely, a hybrid, an innate with open parameters. But there's a lot of valuation, I think, that may be part of human nature.
Yeah, I was gonna.
That was a little bit of a long. Did we start with the global self?
Yeah, we did start with the global self.
Okay.
Yes.
So okay, this insanely long meandering thing. Let me recap that the global self and the self-conscious emotion, and I think based on my own research and other people's research, I see the shame machine and the guilt machine. And I say, you look at this machinery from an engineering perspective, and they're not at all self-conscious emotions. There are other conscious emotions. And actually, forget about these cute monikers. They are very well engineered. They're exquisitely well engineered machinery for doing specific things. I think that's the more correct answer. And doing social things that have to do with valuation.
Yeah, no, that's a good summary. I would. So there's a few points I wanted to kind of get at there. Many of them you answered, but just to kind of further put a finer point on it. Yes. So on the last bit you were saying there, Yes, I like the hybrid model. It seems, I mean, it's almost I don't want to say impossible, but you can't have two different groups literally around the world that are mapping on and they're correlating and how they're this kind of spectrum or continuum of how shame is being presented or expressed or felt, etc. So
I'm sorry, not just those two groups.
Mm-hmm.
I sampled 15 small-scale societies around the world, and each of the 15 small-scale societies, in their shame, they're tracking the audience valuations expressed by each of the other 14 small-scale societies. So if you do 15 times 14, there's something like 100 I'm forgetting exactly, or maybe 200 pairwise correlations. And I think that every single one of those 200 correlations are positive. And maybe there may be a handful non-significant, but everything is across the board. It's a wall of massive effect sizes. Yeah. So yes, I think it's unlikely. The pure cultural hypothesis, I think, is unlikely.
Yeah. So that's I guess that's kind of my point there, is that I think it makes sense from an evolutionary model that if we're social, primates, or, we have to share this ancestry, this lineage, this history, and we've evolved to be, we're social animals. That's what we are. And what you're saying, which I think I agree with, is that shame is maybe not that it doesn't have anything to do with the self, but that it has more of a there's more topspin on how much the other is implicated, which would make, so there's a few things here, which is it would seem to indicate that what we call traditionally the self-conscious emotions, so we're talking about shame, I don't know if you could say so strongly that those emotions are dependent on others or dependent on an audience, which the inference would be, well, if you're on an island by yourself and you've never lived with anybody, that, you wouldn't have those emotions. But I think that's, it's an unlikely scenario, obviously, and it doesn't really make sense because we're social. So from an evolutionary framework, if you're social, there are going to be emotions that evolve with a higher brain to be dependent on others, not to say that it's divorced from an understanding of a sense of self, but that's a key component. Therefore, because of that piece of it, it would absolutely make sense that, again, people could have things expressed differently. But when you're saying you have all of the 15 by 14 pairwise, that you have all of these different groups that are having these correlations with how shame is, that makes a whole lot of sense for this kind of innate piece of, that's something of what it means to be human, or that's something of what it means to be a social animal, etc. Again, it's not 100% completely, and so I think the hybrid piece is a nice way of saying it, but I don't see how you could have a strict social construction or social culture or aspect of how emotions are. Is how am I understanding all that right? I think I got all that right.
Yes, and I don't doubt that there's a very powerful and distinct and interesting phenomenology in self-inwardly and self-reflective phenomenology in shame and guilt. I absolutely believe that story that John Tangney and Jess Tracy talk about. I absolutely believe that's true. Yeah. What I believe, however, is, or in contrast, is that very interesting and distinct and peculiar self-reflective and self-judgmental phenomenology is the manifestation of a system that is designed to navigate interpersonal relationships. That's, I think.
Yeah, it sounds like it sounds like you're saying yes and, right? It's like, yes, there's some attributional pieces about the self and all that, but then also let's look at the other and the interpersonal components on top of that, I guess. Is
and you can pit those things against, I think there's overlap between the two views, and then you but at the extreme you can pit them against each other.
Sure.
And as we have done recently, the paper is going to come out soon, and when you pit those things against each other, the interpersonal account wins. And it's not a definitive test, I think. The judge is still out there, but the triggers. Okay, so let me put it more concretely. You can contrive experimentally situations that are where you have the threat of being devalued by others. Okay, mm-hmm. That would be the trigger of shame according to the functional interpersonal evolutionary account. And you have the threat of being devalued by others. Okay, but you can create a situation where the cause of that threat of devaluation is about something unstable and specific about yourself. So it's not global, it's not stable. It's to the contrary, okay? Something that in the tiny account should lead to guilt, not shame. Okay?
Right.
So you can do a critical test. There's a threat of devaluation, which is our trigger of shame, but that is okay. So you crash and you damage another person's car because you have a stable neural condition. Okay, mm-hmm. So that's a stable something about your whole global self that you have no control over. So that may be a trigger of shame. Versus you damage the other person's car driving your own car by something that is much more unstable about yourself and less global and more specific. So when you cross these things against each other, the thing that wins is the interpersonal thing. It's a threat of being devalued. So if you have the threat of being devalued with something that is completely specific about yourself and unstable and not global, which according to John Tangney and Jess Tracy would lead to guilt, what you see in the data is that you have shame, not guilt, mm-hmm. as the attributional model predicts. But anyway, yeah.
So this might be. This is very specific, so try and follow me along here. Here's how I'm trying to square the two. So maybe I can do this. Okay, so I really liked what you said about shame as a type of continuum, right? On the far end, you overcompensate, you have shame, you go into hiding, you never come out, you're ashamed, right? And then there's the other end where maybe you don't have any shame and you should, and that's gonna, not be able to help you, navigate certain situations or whatever. Okay. And so you have everything in between. I like that. And I think that maps onto what many things are true of various psychopathologies, for many personality traits, for many things. We see things now on a continuum or the multidimensional kind of way of looking at those things. Okay, fine. So, okay, let's put on the shelf for a minute this global self. All right, that shame is this element of global self. Let's say there are, let me try and use my words right. Let's say that there are multiple pieces of the self, right? There's multiple parts, multiple pieces that make up who we are, right? Let's just go with that for a minute. In that analogy, right, you could say that somebody does a thing, they do something wrong, right? So in the traditional model, the attributional theory, which would be, well, you do a wrong act, you feel bad about it, you feel guilty, so that, traditionally leads to reparative action. But I wonder if you could also feel shame about that act. So there's shame about yourself and the devaluation for that one slice or that one part of the self. So maybe the definition of shame does not have to be global, but that you can have shame, the feeling of shame, and you would have to reconstruct the definition, I think, a little bit, but you could feel potentially both shame and guilt. So a shame about a part of yourself, because, for example, people, let me give an example. I'll use myself. I could, be an asshole to somebody at my job, right? I could say X, Y, and Z, blah, 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 blah. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you get this all sorted out? I don't even know why you work here, whatever. Just an asshole, right? I'm terrible. Just a terrible person, right? And let's say I feel guilty that I said that, or I did that, or whatever. And then maybe I say that that's an ugly part of me, right? I feel shame about how I treat my fellow coworkers, right? Let's say something analogous happens when I'm at home. My wife or my daughter, they make a mistake, they make an error. And I say, well, mistakes happen. It's okay. It's fine. And I handle it wildly differently, right? Still the same person, right? But there's different components of myself that I could feel shame in something totally different, in different contexts with different people. And then there's another part of me that can not feel shame, right? I wonder if, in how we understand the kind of phenomenology of individuals, knowing how complex we are, if it's possible to say, yeah, maybe we didn't quite get it right. Maybe it's not shame as defined by the global self. Rather, shame could be felt in pieces of the self, and you could or could not feel guilty about some of the actions or the events. And that could kind of map on and fit to this kind of continuum piece of things where, yeah, maybe you should feel a little bit of shame, a small amount, because that's going to help you, correct for things or what have you, right? And of course, you wouldn't want people to feel this kind of crushing weight of shame where they're incapacitated emotionally. And so maybe there's a kind of middle way here. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that's very interesting what you're saying. We've talked about shame as a machine that helps you navigate the problem of reputational threat and evaluation from others. And the other part of the equation may be guilt. And the problem is slightly different in guilt. That's a hypothesis. So Lina Kosmis and John Tooby and others have hypotheses about guilt. And in guilt, the problem is that you may treat people that you value or that are valuable to you and unduly impose costs on them, usually unintentionally. And the interesting part here is that by harming them, you're indirectly harming themselves. These are people usually in communal relationships. These are, for example, family, friends, people that you really care about. You value, you feel close to, and you are willing to sacrifice for them, and so on. Sometimes mistakes happen, and or lack of information and noise happen, and you impose costs on them. And by harming them, these are people who rise and fall with you, rising and falling together. Interdependence is important in guilt, and so by harming them, you're worse off. And so in guilt, the key thing, I think, unlike shame, that you have incentives, it's in your own best interest to correct that, so that going forward you undo that, or you not do it in the future. So because again, by harming them, you're harming yourself. So there you have incentives to correct, whether or not they devalue you, whether or not they know that you are the source of the harm, whether or not they know that a harm was imposed on them in the first place. Okay, so you had money for your baby, for buying food for your baby. You accidentally lost that money. You are harming your baby. Now your baby doesn't eat. He's crying, terribly feeling bad, crying. You're feeling terrible. Your baby doesn't know. He doesn't have power or strength to punch you. The baby doesn't even know that it was you. The baby doesn't know the cause of anything. He's just hungry. And you feel terribly guilty about that. Okay, so that's the guilt machine and the shame machine. And in the guilt and shame literature, the paradigmatic or stereotypical behaviors that guilt and shame do, shame paradigmatically, stereotypically hides, and guilt approaches and apologizes and confesses and makes up. Those are clusters and syndromes of behaviors that are very much so this theory, whether or not ultimately this theory is true, in the interim, it can accommodate massive amounts of facts about guilt and shame. Guilt reliably repairs, because the point is to reliably repair, whether or not they know. There's beautiful research by Richard Smith on guilt is insensitive to whether other people see you or not. Shame is very much sensitive. If other people see you in shame, you apologize and, oh my God, you appease. If other people don't see you, you just hide and you forget. Okay, so shame and guilt sometimes or often they trigger together, they fire together, they activate together, because some actions that you do carry with themselves the risk of being devalued by others and the problem of unduly devaluing other people that you value. So you do something, you do something bad for a friend, maybe a mistake, so you feel guilt, but also you feel the shame, the fear that they may dislike you. But shame and guilt can be, in theory, and I think in practice, decoupled. So you might feel guilt but not shame, shame but not guilt, but not guilt. So if you feel guilt about a possible act of sexual infidelity, you don't commit it. You guilt in prospect causes you to refrain from committing the sexual infidelity. Mm-hmm. If you have shame about the sexual infidelity but not guilt, you may commit the sexual infidelity in private, in secret. Mm-hmm. And maybe one last thing to say about these things is that maybe going back to the global versus non-global theory of shame and guilt, I think there's something interesting about the globality and stability of shame and guilt, but not for the reasons that the attributional theorists believe. But I think as concomitants of the type of problems that shame and guilt deal with. So I would say the differences between shame and guilt are not interpretative differences caused by your attributional style, that it's just a function of how you interpret events. Mm-hmm. In the attributional theory, guilt and shame is purely a matter of how you interpret the event. If you interpret the screw-up as being caused by your whole self, that's shame. Your mm-hmm. specific self, that's guilt. But in this other interpersonal functional theory of shame and guilt are different machines. They deal with very different problems, adaptive problems. Now, so for example, the uncontrollability of shame, it could be that, so if you correct in guilt, once you correct your valuation of the other, let's say you pay more attention to the harm that you cause to the other, such that you don't do it in the future, that the problem of guilt is solved once you recalibrate yourself to pay more attention to the other person's values and to treat them better in the future. So guilt is, that problem is completely automatically terminated, and the operation of guilt in theory should terminate or interrupt once you correct. By contrast, if you have a shame problem where you harm another person, the problem of shame is not necessarily done and over once you can correct the devaluation from the one person that you harm. Because, for example, there may be third parties that are going to devalue you. And whereas in guilt, it's up to you to correct your valuations. In shame, it's up to other people to correct their valuations about you. It's the problem of causing others to devalue you not, or to devalue you less, is completely outside of your control. And moreover, there's many people doing that. So apologizing in shame or doing something nice in shame completely doesn't terminate the operation of shame, because you have the famous PR problem that it's out there mm-hmm. In common knowledge, and it's completely out of your control. You have some control, but so I think that the phenomenology that shame feels global and uncontrollable, and all of those things may be phenomenological concomitants of these problems. But if my hypothesis is correct, these concomitants, these real phenomenological feelings, are not caused by an issue of interpretation and of your attributional style. They are concomitants of real things, for example, and real things with real consequences. For example, many people are devaluing you and you have no control. It's uncontrollable, like June Tangney says of shame.
So I have a little bit, I track with you. I think I track with what you're saying, and I agree with a large part of it, but I think I may disagree on one piece, which is that the feeling of shame is the individual's feeling, right? Whether people devalue or do not devalue is not going to determine what the feeling is going to be for the individual. So, for example, if I feel shame, yes, I think there's a huge component of which that feeling is dependent on the perceptions or the devaluation or whatever from other people. 100%, I agree with that. Uh-huh. But the feeling is mine. It's not other people's feelings. They don't feel shame. I feel shame. And so at a certain point, right, wouldn't it have to be that You could feel shame about an aspect of who you are, but it's not the total summation of who you are. And so, and further, sometimes this is a little bit more aspect of abstraction, but the fear or the anticipation better is of shame can be helpful. It can be adaptive for one person, right? You know what? If I steal this money from somebody and all of these things, I'm not going to feel good about it. Or there's a part of me that's not going to feel good about it. Not necessarily only depending on the action. I could do it. I could apologize. We square it away. It's fine. But I'm still going to feel, even after we've repaired it, like I'm kind of a shitty person, right? Or this piece of me feels shitty. So that feeling of, oh, I can know what the shame is like, or I can have an element of that, which is dependent on how the other person may perceive you or whatever, can be helpful for pro-social or preventative measures, right? To say, hey, maybe don't do that, or a lesser extent, or whatever. So I don't know if that's all. I guess the part about the attribution piece of it is I agree that in many ways, shame is other dependent. I really agree with that. But I do think that in terms of the attributional aspects of it, it's always your feeling. It's always internal for you.
Absolutely. I don't disagree at all with the fact that it's your own feeling about the self. I 100% agree with that. I think with the ground facts, I do agree very much. Shame feels terrible. Shame feels about the self.
Yeah.
Shame feels that yourself is defective. Shame feels horrible. It's one of the most aversive emotions. With all those statements, I completely agree. I think the contrast between the theories and the ways of thinking about these things is that feeling, you can think of feeling as an output of a computation.
Mm-hmm.
The feeling is not disorganized or just an outburst, a disorganized random outburst of emotion or feeling. The feeling is very well engineered to do something. And again, you have access to the output, the feeling. You don't have access to the underlying computation, just like vision. Mm-hmm. You have access to the high level representation of a color of a fruit, but you have no idea about all the underlying computations for vision. And you have access to that terrible self-devaluing feeling of shame. But the hypothesis, which I think square with the facts to some extent, and there is a lot of that we don't know, but the hypothesis is that that feeling is organized, and that feeling is conveying information. It's conveying information from the outside in reality or in anticipation and in probabilistic information. What the feeling is conveying is that you feel bad, but the feeling is conveying information about the likely or actual degree and consequences of bad things happening from others if and when others find out about the disgraceful action about yourself. So absolutely, you feel bad about yourself, but that bad feeling is something that is alerting you to external threats. It's a little bit like, or very much like the theory of the sociometer theory of self-esteem of Mark Leary et al. The self-esteem is not just, the self-esteem is a feeling, is a self-feeling, how much I esteem myself, right. how the self esteems the self. But Mark Leary and others found, very much like in the shame and pride theory that we've been elaborating, that the self-esteem is not disorganized. It's very well organized. It's organized for what? Well, there's infinite alternative hypotheses, but one that is intriguing is the possibility that the self-esteem is very sensitive to the degree to which other people include and value and esteem the self. So paradoxically, or not, maybe it's not a paradox at all, the feelings feels about the self, because after all, the feeling is part of the computation generated by the brain itself. So it's the brain generating and decoding the computation. But But the nature of the problem is the people outside of you. If people hate you, people exclude you, people think you're a terrible human being, you feel terrible about yourself. Mm-hmm. And there's many interesting things. It's a bad idea to tamper with that internal readout. It's like Mark Leary says that tampering and inflating self-esteem divorced from what other people really think of you can lead. It's like tampering with a fuel gauge. It's a terrible idea because it conveys super important information for you. And if you tamper with a fuel gauge, you may feel good that you have always full, but you don't know when you're going to run out of gas, you're going to be stranded in the middle of the highway. It's a terrible idea.
Right.
It's very functional. And it's tracking an external thing, the actual fuel in the external real world of real consequences. And with the feeling of shame, tracking the real world consequences of other people's devaluation is exactly the same story. These self feelings are there for good reasons. So this researcher, Randy at ASU, forgetting the name, foreign researcher, he has a book on good reasons for bad feelings. It's exactly the same.
Yeah. Yes. I'm familiar. Yeah. Yeah. I guess I don't disagree with you. I guess I'm just on this bit. I guess I'm one of those people that's trying to make sense of all of the different, and that's why we do more science, right? We try to figure it out, of all of the components of the other and the self and the various so many different parts of the self and how they are interacting. Because when you were talking, I was thinking you were talking about the shame and the guilt, right? In many scenarios, although not all, the common denominator there is there's something that happens and there's an experience of it. Now, we can have different emotional experiences about it. We could have shame and guilt. We could have just shame, or we could have just guilt. But in many ways, the same event or the same antecedents or whatever are kind of at the base of that. And it's interesting how it can split either way. You could have other emotions in the mix too, or you could have many emotions at the same time. And so I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to adequately pinpoint and importantly is how do we know what are some generalizable distinct experiences that people have that we can put emotional labels on or whatever. So then you can try and help, if you're clinical or whatever, you can try and help people to be more regulated, et cetera, which I guess to that end, I want to, we haven't talked about too much, but I know you've written on this too. And so I don't want to, throw in a new emotion here, but I am curious about this. So I did, when I talked to Jess Tracy last year as well, and she's great. And we talked about pride and how shame and pride have this kind of, yin yang kind of thing. Right. And I guess I want to, we had this long discussion. I won't recount all of it, but we had this idea about hubristic pride and negative shame, right? As these kind of polarities of sorts. And so that some people that may express hubristic pride may have a deep negative shame underlying it, right? How do we understand those two layers of emotions, and I guess how they work together, right? Maybe it's a chicken egg thing, I don't know. And again, it might be different, right? Because she's coming from a different model. So, but you're just in that idea of hubristic pride versus negative shame. Do you see those as kind of connected? Is that maybe am I conceptualizing this just in a kind of false way, or how do you see that idea?
Yes, I cut the salami a little bit differently from Jess, although I very much respect and admire her work. The basic thing to say about pride is that pride may be the mirror image of shame if it's useful for an organism to not be divided and shunned and ostracized. For social organisms such as humans, it's also good to cultivate and harvest positive social valuation from others, liking, respect, status, and so on, to the extent that we can cultivate, produce goods and services and develop characteristics that other people value to become valuable in your own environment. And pride appears to be the system that does that. Not only advertises, so Jess has a lot of research on the very interesting display of pride, but also it does it does many other interesting things. It's in preparation, it incentivizes and propels you, motivates you to achieve those things. Then also it closes the evaluation loop such that it's not just about advertising. If you achieve and advertise and do nothing else, that's missing the point. You need to make sure your pride needs, or something in the pride system needs to make sure that the other people increase their valuation consonant and in correspondence to your newfound incremental marginal value, right? Your worth.
Mm-hmm.
So all of these heightened sense of entitlement that people feel in pride is part of the pride system, and is very interesting, and it's related to anger and shame. And people don't talk too much about these things, but these are important elements of the pride system. And I have to say that we've run also researching many industrial and non-industrial societies, and we find these similar findings as with shame. The more an action or trait is valued in a given ecology, the more by audiences, the more people feel anticipatory pride at the prospect of achieving that success. And there's correlations across all the cultures. So this logic of pride is cross-translatable across very different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
So the more people in Turkey value a given action, the more people in Korea and Japan and France feel pride if they themselves achieve that thing. Which, by the way, is there's a footnote there to research on Stephen Heine and Lorenz Ayan and other people arguing that people in communal cultures, East Asian cultures, don't have self-enhancement. I think this research suggests that the strong theory of the lack of self-enhancement in East Asia is probably wrong, because there would be, otherwise it's hard to explain why the pride of the Japanese and South Koreans and so on very closely calibrated to the evaluations of not only the fellow Japanese and South Koreans, but also the evaluations of people from very individualistic societies such as the United States and England and so on. Okay, so that's the basic thing. And now the more fine-grained question of what about hubristic pride and shame. I think the gist argument for hubristic pride is a little bit. There's a number of different notions that converge in hubristic pride, the way she talks about that. There's a hubristic in the sense of attributing the success to your whole self or the global self. That's definition number one. Then she has a definition number two. Sometimes it's hubristic in the sense of being a bully by dominance rather than achievement. And definition number three that sometimes crops out, and Dan Fessler and Holbrook have critiqued this, is maybe it's the pride in excess of your actual worth. So there's the expression acting bigger than your britches, and people don't like it when you're acting with more entitlement than your actual social worth is worth. And that's simply based on the economics of the social valuation. If you're worth 5, it's prudent for me to invest and defer to you by 5. But if you're 5 and you are trumpeting to us that you're worth 15, then if I treat you at 15 and not at 5, then I'm wasting my investment in you. So that predicts that people will be averse and punitive to other people's deceptive trumpeting of their own self-worth in excess of what they're actually worth, and what they're worth in the logic of the peculiar mental logic of imputing value to others based on their actions and characteristics. And pride also has a bad rap for other reasons. That ties to envy. There's an extremely interesting psychology of envy. We resent other people's successes and achievements. So if someone is worth 4 and then they develop some awesome skill and now they're worth 7, and now people have issues with pride even if their pride is correctly calibrated, I believe. Mm-hmm. So it's a problem. If they went from 5 to 7 and they're trumpeting at 15, that's a problem. But if they went from 4 to 7 and they have a newfound pride and entitlement worth calibrated at exactly 7, I think there's issues with pride in addition to the issue of overclaiming, which is the issue of envy. People are envious of other people's achievements for long reasons, long to be discussed. But the issue of envy, I think, is intuitive. Not myself. I've never felt envy myself. But other people tell me that they feel envy, but I don't have the emotional envy. I'm a very good person. But my friends tell me that they feel a lot of envy. And okay, so that was a joke. I don't know if you achieved to make the joke. And so envy. So there's the famous biblical phrase, "Pride goeth before a fall," and I think there's a lot of envy there. But okay, so in the J's account, there's all these ideas are a little bit conflated, I think. But yes, I think that you can think about this problem in various ways. But one is your status appetite, how hungry for status you are, how hungry to be number one.
Yeah.
And so if you have an excessive or very high appetite for social status, that's fine. That's what it is. Okay, so that predicts that you may be very obsessed about having pride and showing your pride and having achievements and trumpeting your achievements, maybe whether or not those things are true, but you're driven to convince others that you're awesome. So that predicts high over trumpeting in pride. And I'm not talking too much about the global self of hubristic pride, because that's not part of the way I think about pride. But that predicts the over trumpeting in pride. But that also predicts that if you fall and if you disgrace yourself in public, of course, you will do that no matter what, then you're going to feel a lot of shame. Why? Here, the underlying variable would be the super high appetite for status, and that we need to explain. So, okay, we need to explain individual variation in that and maybe other elements. But if that variable is high, then that predicts a very strong appetite for pride, and also reciprocally, and maybe seemingly paradoxically, but maybe not paradoxically, a lot of shame if you fail. If you're not status obsessed, you fail. That feels bad, of course. You feel shame. But if you are super obsessively consumed by this killing desire to have alpha status, then you fail. That's a huge deal. So that feels like very high shame.
Yeah, it seems to make, at least for me, this type of way of viewing it as there seems to be a connection with that. I don't know. I don't want to speculate how much or how less, but it does seem that there is some piece of that, which again, with the status piece. So obviously many people will ascribe pride as one of the benefits of pride, or one of the features, I should say, of pride is this pushing for status, right? Wanting to gain status, which is not a good or a bad thing, right? I mean, there's social animals do that, right? You need that for various reasons, and that's a good and a healthy thing, although there are perversions of that. And so, but to your point earlier, if in that way that is not received, the status piece, well, that's an interesting feature for shame, of feeling shame about maybe many parts of yourself, or and would give more argument or more support for the idea that shame is very much other as opposed to self attributional, which is also very interesting. Well, listen, Daniel, I could talk to you all day about emotions. This is, absolutely, for me, very exhilarating stuff. I really appreciate it, but I want to respect your time. I guess my last question here is where can people find your research? Where can they find you? Where's the best places to look up all the wonderful things you're doing?
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure for me to talk with you, Xavier. And people can find my research on my website, which I'm communicating to you via chat, sznycerlab.org. And we have quite a bit of research, all done new there.
Yeah, no, that's great. I will definitely put it in the notes, and keep doing what you're doing. We need folks like you doing such great research. So I just can't say enough thanks for you coming on, giving me your time, your energy, your brilliance. It's been really, really just so much fun.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much for your invitation. It was excellent to talk with you.
Yeah, thank you.